Hi, hello, welcome. So tonight we wanted to start our conversation around um, this is a kind of tying a bow on several conversations that we've had, not only on here but on our podcast as well. And wanted to start it off with the layers that we communicate at, because there's been concern and questions around, like if you're trying to wake someone up, you're trying to get them to see facts about something, and understanding that we communicate on three levels simultaneously whenever we communicate with someone. So first, there's the superficial level that we communicate at, which is, exchange of information, right? Whether we're talking about facts or whether we're talking about events, circumstances, things like that. So it's just an exchange of information. That's the superficial level of a conversation. Below that is the emotional level of a conversation. And then below that is the level of identity, where you actually tie in the subject with how you define yourself, or the story about the story you have about who you are. So there's those three layers of communication that we're going to be addressing, and we're going to be tying that into not only how why it's difficult to communicate facts to people, when you're trying to wake them up to something, but also how this same phenomenon of layers of communication is also used to indoctrinate people, and it's used to, like the cult, cults are created. And I noticed an interesting phenomenon in our society right now, where they're literally using these techniques to create a cult, and I'll call it the cult of wokeness, on a massive scale. Typically, when you're trying to get someone in your cult, it's like a one-on-one process, right? Like someone finds the individual and you play on them at an emotional level. The surface of the cult is always shiny and bright and looks really good and is playing on someone's emotion. And we see this in, for instance, in, let's see, what's an example? Well, let's take wokeness, for example. So they play on the emotion that, people experience injustice in the world, right? And so they're playing on that sense of injustice in people, and people who define themselves as good people, or who have an emotional response to the injustice, get taken in. Okay, so on the surface, it looks like a good thing. Hey, we're concerned about justice. We're concerned about fair treatment and things like that. And so it seems like a really good thing. And then at the deeper levels, you start to indoctrinate. So you start to infuse the person. And again, you're still playing on those emotions with ideas that not only make them virtuous for being a member of the cult, but also make those outside non-virtuous, right? And again, you're seeing this play out in society, where the entire media and the entire industrial apparatus is playing this game, where if you're not down with our ideologies, and you don't believe what we believe, and you didn't vote the way that we voted, then you're a racist, a bigot, a transphobe, and they've got this whole list. So they label other as bad. Okay, so this is part of the indoctrination process. And then you move into the reprogramming, where you start to literally get people to interpret the world through the lens of the cult. Okay, and this, again, this is being done on a mass scale that I don't think it's ever been done like this that I'm aware of. And in that reprogramming stage, you also get people to divide and separate themselves from people they were close to. They divide and separate themselves from family members. They divide and separate themselves from, longtime friends and things like that, which again, this is typical of any cult. Like, you guys wouldn't be surprised if I was talking about Scientology or something, but you would be surprised if I was talking about a political party or political leaning or a movement that encompasses half the population or something like that. And that's the scale they're working on. In fact, I don't know if you guys seen the CNN news anchor, Don Lemon, actually going out on a news broadcast and talking about how he's had to cut people out of his life who do not think like him. So this is perpetuating this cult-like mentality at a massive scale, worldwide in scope. And so it goes far beyond the working on an individual level that we've seen before. Now, a phenomenon that you will experience if, like, let's say you're trying to, convey some facts to someone, right? And it's called the backfire phenomenon, or the backfire effect. Okay, and this has to do with when someone has tied their identity to the facts that you're speaking of. So, for example, if we take an anti-vaxxer parent and a pro-vaxxer parent, right? Pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine. Now, both of them have tied their belief to the identity of being a good parent. The anti-vaxxer is against vaccines because they don't want their child to be harmed. So they've tied their identity of quote unquote good parent to the concept of vaccines. And the pro-vaxxer has done the same thing. Now, I'm using this because this is a pretty nonpartisan issue. And what I mean by that is you have pro-vax and anti-vax on both sides of the political spectrum. So I wanted to start off with an example that doesn't necessarily divide down the lines of the political spectrum. So, and the backfire effect is when you present, like, let's say I have a set of facts. This is scientific evidence, and it is contrary to let's say the anti-vaxxer's belief. Okay. The backfire effect is that even though I present scientific evidence, which clearly delineates, let's say, no risk and benefit and all this other stuff, they will actually, rather than switch their view, they will actually double down on their belief. And same with if you go to the pro-vaxxer parent and present them with the same evidence that, look, there's great harm in these chemicals that are in the vaccines. Here's scientific studies showing the short-term effects, the long-term effects, and the risk to benefit analysis. Like, you could have a stack of scientific data, but because they've tied their identity of good parent to being pro-vaccine, they will double down on their belief. Okay, so this is the backfire effect that many of you will experience when you're trying to wake someone up with information, with facts, is that because they've tied their identity into the subject that you're talking about. And remember, you're always communicating on all three levels simultaneously. You're communicating the information at the top level, right? And then underneath that, you're communicating on an emotional level, and underneath that, you're communicating to a person's sense of self, their subjective identity, okay? And they've tied their actual identity to the topic. And that's why sometimes, lots of times, you may experience a irrational response to what seem like neutral facts, right? This is just a set of facts. This is just evidence. And so there's a complete rejection and a doubling down on the information as opposed to an openness to this. And the reason why I feel like this is an important subject is because this isn't happening exclusively on one side of the political spectrum or another. This isn't happening exclusively on, in one ideology and not in another. This is happening across the board. We're seeing this at every level right now, and it's working in the sense that it's dividing the people against themselves. So again, losing sight of who's really against you and who's really your quote unquote enemy is hidden, because this tendency to divide along these ideological lines based on a narrative, a story you have about yourself, is being played out in all aspects of our society right now, on both sides of the political spectrum. And you see it when you define the group that you're with. And so it's like, and the reason I brought cults into this is because it's a cult-like mentality where, like, let's say on the patriot side of things, like I've heard people use the phrase, well, there's only two groups, there's patriots and there's traitors, right? And so that's happening on the right. And they kind of see it that if you're not with us, well, then you're a traitor. You're against us, and you're against the Constitution. You're against the country. And so this is polarization. This is separation. This is dividing people. This is putting people at odds. This is creating an enemy. Okay? And then on the left, you have the same thing, where they're defining anyone who doesn't believe in their ideology as fascists, as white supremacists, as racists, as bigots, right? So this is happening in all aspects, this cult-like mentality over these ideologies. And so that's basically the gist of where I want to go with this. And I know, Gingy, you actually have personal experience with being drawn into a cult.
Yep, I'd say a few. I'd say a few examples, but one as recent as less than a year ago. Do you want me to speak into it a little bit?
Yeah. So give us an actual example of how this process played out, and I'll set it up with, typically, when being brought in to this cult-like mentality. Like I said, you need to be aware of this because this is happening on a mass scale. They're using all forms of media. They're using social media. They're using all the tools at their disposal to do this mass indoctrination. And so there's three levels. I talked about the first being the initiation, where you're basically played on an emotional level. It kind of gets you in the door. Then there's the indoctrination, which is like giving you a whole new set of ways of looking at things and ways of perceiving yourself as virtuous and others as not virtuous. And then there's a reprogramming, where a lens is established through which you now interpret the world through this lens, and this lens reshapes your beliefs. It reshapes the way you think. It reshapes the way you speak based on the ideology of the cult. So yeah, Gingy, give me your experiences with that.
Well, first off, I'll say that I've got my own pre-qualifications, if you will, for what a cult is. And to me, it can be cult-like or have cult mentality without being a full-blown cult if it doesn't have, I'll say, a spiritual aspect to it. So if at the end you're going to be enlightened or one of the messengers of God or what have you, then to me that's a full-blown cult. A human has stepped in and said, I am the God, everybody follow me. That's a cult. But there are lots of things that can be cult-like. For instance, without naming names, because I don't really want to call anybody out, there was a group that I was associated with a little more than a year ago. I want to say I got involved with them in maybe November, and I started going to their meetings and well, workouts, because it was a workout group specifically. And I'm not talking about P90X, even though that can kind of be culty too. This was something much more niche, and I met them. They spoke like a lot of people in the transformational field, very empowering, definitely playing to the emotional state that people are at, definitely being like the cure-all come from. Like, oh, whatever issue you have, just do some squats and it'll just work itself out type of idea. And what I found was every single one of their exercises or drills, which were basically patented by this high level guy, whoever was at the top of it, they were incredibly effective. And there were ways to hone in on specific muscle groups which generally go unaddressed. Like it's kind of one of the reasons why you can see a bodybuilder lose an arm wrestling match to somebody half their size, because this guy's strengthened much more muscles in the arms than the bodybuilder, because they're just going for physique. These drills were meant to how can I say it, to help the body be injury resilient and to increase flexibility and strength. And it wasn't about bulking up, or I mean, it could have been if some people were going those routes, but regardless, big shiny object, some of the best workouts and very niche workouts I've ever seen. And the people that were involved were just awesome, super community oriented and being of service, and they spoke all the right words, they played all the right emotions. And so I found myself in a place where I was advocating for them. Literally every person I was talking to, I was like, oh, if you don't know about these workouts, this is where you need to be, man. This is the shit. And they started asking me if I was interested in joining the bigger group, the global group. Because this was just like a come work out with us on Sundays type of thing. And it's free to go once a month, but then you have to pay a little bit to go once a week. And then I started working out with some of the other people once, several times a week. Were you going to say something, Cam?
Yeah, Mr. Fair. I'm sorry to interrupt. Is this yoga by chance?
No, it's not.
I had to ask. You said
it's a
something
version
about
of martial arts.
Good for you. Good for you.
Yeah, it's a version of martial arts. Go ahead.
Also, what's the difference between a cult and a fraternity?
My own distinction, which I laid out just a minute ago, was that a cult will actually have like a spiritual or religious end point down the line. Like with Scientology, you become this enlightened person down the line where you're like spiritually evolved to some immense degree. However, P90X, it's very cult-like, and you may even with like hot yoga or Bikram yoga, you may have some guru at the end of the tunnel that's teaching all of this stuff, but ultimately it's just about whatever the subject matter is, and it'll create a cult-like following, but it's not quite a cult. So with something like a fraternity, it is very culty, but they're not following any specific religion or spiritual practices. They're just all operating through the same lens or same information or worldview. Does that make sense?
Good point. Yeah, sure. Makes sense.
And I don't know if Brandon, you have a different understanding of cults, but that's for me where I draw the line.
I apologize for interrupting.
Oh, it's all right. Go ahead and just finish out your story, and then I'll touch on it.
Okay, cool. So, where was I? I was at the point of advocating. So at this point, I'm in the indoctrination. I have been fully indoctrinated. I have taken the pill. I'm full-on believer. I'm seeing all the benefits and none of the side effects. And I haven't cut anybody out of my life yet. And I struggled for a long time trying to figure out if I was going to join the global group because there was no real explanation provided to me of what it was. Some people like it's a place to practice, it's a place to work on whatever you want to, it's a place to find community, it's a place to whatever. Everybody had a different experience or different explanation of what it was for them, which to me was a little bit concerning, but I've also been through, you know, transformational workshops where it's like whatever you bring to the table is what you create in this space. So I was in that headspace going into it, thinking like I can create anything in this awesome space. So I get into it, and once I joined the global group, I didn't last more than a month, and I had to make a 12-month commitment. And for me, getting into that space and attempting to work that space, I was met with resistance at every turn. It was as if no matter what I did, what I said, or what direction I moved in, I was getting criticized and beat down because of it. So if someone would say, hey, you're too much in your head, then I would get out of my head and I'd start doing drills or, meditating or something like that. And people would say, you're disconnected. You need to, join the group, or you need to communicate, or you need to basically engage mentally again. And so then I was working on a balance of that. And they said, well, you're doing this. And they had a term for everything. What I'm describing right now is what they called a classic over-under. And when I asked what this is, what that means, I was met with a Michael Jackson rhyme. He said, you're too high to get over, yeah, yeah. Too low to get under, yeah, yeah. You're stuck in the middle, yeah, yeah. And I was left to interpret exactly what that meant.
Did they literally sing the song?
I mean, via text, but yeah. No, the dude, I don't remember. It would not surprise me if the leader actually sang it. I'm pretty sure he did. I mean, there's so many of these things that happen. But it's just like one of the next things I was trying to learn is how to not burn myself out by pushing too hard or going too slow, and work that sweet spot. So basically, they had all of these terminologies, all of these explanations, or really to me, they're kind of like excuses, and most of them were oxymoronic, or they conflicted with something else. Like, Gingy, you need to communicate. But then when I communicated, I would get called out for it. And there was no constructive, hey, have you tried doing something like this? Or, hey, what is it that you're really trying to create? Or is this what you meant to say here? I would say something like, yeah, guys, I'm having a great day, and I'm deciding whether I want to do this today or this today. And I'd be like, hey, Gingy, you don't listen. Like, well, what do you mean? Well, I don't listen in my life, which means you don't listen in your life. Okay. Well, what can I do about that? Well, you can listen. Okay. When did I not listen? I don't have any examples for you. Just listen. So it was very much so a set of restrictions or boundaries imposed, meant to diminish or beat down this person to the point where they had nowhere else to go, so that the group, or the worldview of the group, can reconstruct this individual, break them down to build them back up, and
complete conformity.
exactly.
Like, had you just started repeating the bullshit phrases that they said, well, then you would have got along swimmingly, wouldn't you?
Yeah. And for me, one of the biggest things I got is, Gingy, you need to listen more. or no, you need to communicate more. And so for me, communication is speaking, listening, it's body language, it's, emotional, it's intuitive. There's lots of levels to communicate at. And really, every time I would say, I'm having a great day, they'd be like, Ginger, you're in your head too much. Or they give me some criticism. And I would say, well, what do you mean by that? And we'd go down this whole other line where ultimately they weren't hearing what I was saying. They weren't listening. They weren't communicating or participating in communication. And okay, I shit you not. After I quit, one of the guys that I was closest to, he basically came to me and said, Gingy, I'm committed to creating love and connection in my life, so I would like it if we could never speak or see each other again. And I would, in my mind,
that seems like a contradiction.
And that's what I mean. This is how the nature of the entire environment, and what these people, as I saw it clear as day, were indoctrinated into. Yes, they were experiencing major breakthroughs in their lives, and they were improving their relationships and all these other things, but at the cost of individual rationale. Like their
Right.
individual ability to think for themselves was sacrificed for the rest of the benefits that came. And that's like, I swear that's something I'm incapable of. I cannot surrender my ability to think for myself. It may be part of my personality type or the muscles I've strengthened over my lifetime, but if I'm committed to creating love and connection in my life, then to cut somebody out of my life seems completely counterproductive, especially somebody who's committed to staying in my life. If this person's like, hey, I love you no matter what, you're like, oh, that's awesome. Leave me alone forever and don't talk to me. So the nature of this entire environment, one of the other things he said to me was that he was absolutely astonished that my ego had been impervious to all of the gifts that they had given me, or all of the work that they had been doing with me. Basically meaning I didn't change my self-esteem. I didn't change my view of who I am in the world, my identity. I didn't change my values, my morals, my principles, because these people kept giving me shit. Because I stayed true to myself and I was there curious and trying to learn, it didn't work. And since I left, I have talked to one of them, one conversation since I left that group. And there's one other exception that I'm not going to get into right now, but everybody that I really met and connected with in that group, complete disconnection. And I'm not eager to chase them down and to force them to be connected with me. I respect anybody's choice to create connection or to, create disconnection.
Right.
However,
And I think that speaks perfectly into the question that Cameron had on the distinctions between, let's just say, a cult and he said fraternity or any other group, right?
Right.
And it is that separating yourself from others. Like, for instance, you were telling me about that special on Scientology, where you must separate yourself from people who do not believe in the doctrine, right?
We separated from the mainstream bullshit, basically. So we have to have that disconnect. I get what you're saying. I'm sorry. Keep going.
Yeah, no problem. And so they force it. Whatever separation you just talked about, you chose, right? In a cult, it's like they've separated themselves that if you don't have this ideology, then you must separate yourself. And this is what you're seeing with the wokeness cult, right? The cult of wokeness is saying, if people do not believe what we believe, and I mean, they're going so far as to say they need to be sent to re-education camps. You need to get them out of your life. You need to separate these people. That's how a cult operates. It demands conformity, and it demands separation from people who do not share the ideologies.
Let me add one more thing.
It basically forces you to oust people who don't share the ideology, to hold them separate from you, to not speak with them, to not gather with people like that, to not be in the same space with people like that.
Or create relationships.
Right.
So the other thing that I didn't say about this is that through this entire process, I was creating a community in a city I haven't lived in very long, and haven't created more than a couple of friends, a handful of new friends. And so I had created a network of people through meeting and going to these workouts every week, several times a week, to where I was finally starting to build a little community that I was engaged in and enjoying. And I shit you not, the leader, he went through his whole spiel and gave me so much personal attention in the group, I eventually was like, yeah, this is all great. I still want to quit. And he goes, okay, well, that's fine. You can do that. That's totally your choice, but you're not allowed to be engaged with any of my work. I'm like, well, what do you mean by that? He's like, you can't go to those group meetings that this other dude has set up in your town, and you can't. I was like, well, okay, that's fine. Like, I don't have to go work out with these people. I can. And I told him this. I was like, I can just, go to the movies or something with them, or go to dinner, and still have my friends and my community and stuff. And he goes, Gingy, you don't get it. By engaging with any of them, you are engaging with my lineage, my work. He's like, basically claiming these people as his people, his lineage, his work, his property, saying they're free to do whatever the heck they want to do, but I will make it abundantly clear to them how I feel about it. He did not want me to be involved with any of the people I had connected with, period, and openly voiced that to everybody else. And some people full on believed him. Some people were like, well, we might be able to kind of negotiate this a little bit because it's not his group, it's whatever the other guy, the local guy's group. And maybe even doing one-on-one lessons or something like that. But obviously that's not the way that it worked out. But it was intentionally and directly communicated to me that by leaving the big group, the global group, and not engaging in this online network, that because I had taken this step all the way in, I was not allowed to step back and leave. Now, had I never joined the big group and I just stayed on the periphery, I'd have stayed as this potential indoctrination-y. I don't know how that means. A potential sale or enrollment.
Acolyte.
Yeah. And I'd be free to continue doing what I was doing for the first 6 months or so. But because I had stepped in and said, this isn't for me, I'm leaving, everybody else was at least, at the very minimum, under pressure to disconnect from me. And every single one of them did. It blows my mind.
There's a saying by Alan Quotes I like. We have a level of involvement and we have a level of detachment. And what he says is that you kind of have to have an equilibrium between the two. So you have to have like the same level of involvement as the same level of detachment, if that makes any sense.
Well, it sounds like maybe a healthy way to approach a group if there is an ideological basis to the group. Because again, we're talking about those 3 levels of communication. So, originally this conversation was about, how do I wake up people in my life, right? Well, when they've tied their identity to an ideology, right, to a set of facts, to some information, then there is no, what you're calling, detachment from it. They've not only become attached at a, let's say, an intellectual level to the ideas, they've actually tied their identity to those ideas, like I gave in the example of the anti-vaxxer and the vaxxer, right? They at some level, they identify themselves by the information. And again, you're seeing this in the cult of wokeness, in that people have tied their identity to, I'm a social justice warrior, right? I stand for social justice, even though all the principles they stand for are the opposite of justice. Even though they stand for racism, but claim to be anti-racism. They're pushing fascist ideologies, but they claim to be anti-fascist. So, but because they've tied their identity to the virtues, the quote unquote virtues, the virtues they've been told that they have by adopting this ideology, it's tied into their identity. And that's why you get immediate rejection of anything that contradicts that, because their identity is tied to it. It's become synonymous with who they are. So they can't see themselves outside of the lens of the cult, which tells them that they are fighting for social justice, even though they're doing the opposite, you know? And so it's, what is an effective way of communicating with people such that you can address information, or you can have conversations that may actually challenge this identity that they've wrapped up in their ideology. And I would say one of the best examples, I was thinking about this today, and I thought about like where we were at in the early 60s as far as racism in this country. And then I looked at where we were at in the early 90s with regards to racism. And I grew up in the 80s and 90s. And so I saw pretty much the elimination of racism. And as I thought about it, I'm like, well, how did that happen? Because it wasn't by them, you know, doing what they're doing now, trying to guilt everyone and basically bringing racism back. That's not how you get rid of racism. And I thought about, well, who was it? You know, who was it in the 80s and 90s that made racism evaporate? And it became clear to me that some of the greatest quote unquote social justice warriors of the 80s were comedians. Eddie Murphy probably did more to battle racism than any social justice warrior today is doing. Because what he did was he was able to communicate at the level of fun, right? He was able to tease out in people. He was able to bring racism into a conversation and point out racist shit about people in a funny way that allowed people to let go of those racist tendencies because they were laughing about it, right? And
that's
so
a brilliant idea. That's incredible.
Yeah, because it became clear to me because he spoke to those aspects of what we'll call whiteness, right? Where he was able to make fun of, you know, how a white person may react to a black person. He wasn't shaming, he wasn't guilting, he wasn't making people wrong about it. He was making fun of it. And it evaporated. And so
the shame along with it.
What's that?
And the shame along with it. I know a lot of people are like embarrassed to say something that might be construed as racist. And now it's like, if I say it, I'm the butt of a joke instead of the embarrassment.
Right. Yeah. So that's like, to me, and I noticed that I do the same thing. Like you guys noticed, like with a lot of the things I post in our group, you know, typically I post it with humor. because there may be people in this group who believe in these doctrines, right? Who really believe that, you know, that this country is absolutely evil and was founded on evil, and everything about it is evil and it needs to be completely destroyed. But rather than me shaming them about their ideology, I make fun of it. I make fun of critical race theory. I make fun of identity politics. And so it would enable someone who's maybe actually invested in these principles to actually be able to not take themselves so seriously, make fun of themselves, and they're more likely to allow those ideologies to disconnect from their identity. So, you know, I always like to bring around a way to a solution to these issues, these social issues, these cultural issues, these philosophical issues that we're facing. And I think that that may be an effective way that we can tease out people's ideologies.
Let me ask you this.
Hold on. But we also have to be able to not take ourselves seriously and not take our own ideology seriously, because we need to be able to stand in a place of acceptance and compassion for other people so that they feel safe to let go of their ideology, because they know that you're not judging them for holding or having that ideology. So if I can tease myself about my own ideologies, and I cannot take myself serious about ideologies that I may espouse, well, then others will be more likely to be able to not take themselves so seriously and be able to tease and make fun of their own ideologies as well.
It's brilliant. It's a great access point. I'm so glad you're talking about this, Brandon, because it's been on my mind. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. It's a discussion. Everyone's welcome to interrupt, just so y'all know.
So let me ask you, Brandon, how do you tease out, how do you have that lighthearted, joyful, everything is good and fun, you know, come from, while also not having the other person have an experience of being patronized or something?
Well, I'll tell you what. I actually did this with someone over the gender pay gap, okay? And my first approach was from a place of just being pissed that people believed it, because they didn't do the research. They didn't look at what this claim was based on. You know, the assumption and presumption of the gender pay gap is that if you take a man and a woman in the same job, the woman's getting paid less. And that's not at all how the gender pay gap has been calculated. The gender pay gap is taking all the money all men get paid, dividing it by the number of men, then taking all the money that all women make and dividing it by the number of women. That's how they got the gender pay gap. And that's the only variable considered is their sex. Now, society is a complex model. It is a complex system. To boil it down to one variable is ridiculous. And when I approached it from that place of like being angry and pissed that people believed it, and that this person that I was talking with was not only believing it, but espousing it and speaking it, I had no effect, right? Went nowhere with it. But over time, because I was able to take myself less seriously with it, I was able to actually have fun and make fun of it and watch the other person's stance and position on it evaporate. Because I was no longer taking it serious, you know, and now when I talk about the facts of it and all the variables not considered, like personality types, like the fact that women have children and don't necessarily stay in the workforce as long as men, that men will actually move to get higher paying jobs, or women are more likely to stay where they're at because of, again, because of psychology, because of personality. These are just things. Men are more likely to work 80-hour weeks as opposed to 40-hour weeks. Women are more likely to have part-time jobs because they're balancing with the family. So none of these factors were ever taken into account when boiling down the numbers. But when I came from a serious place and an angry place of this person's position on it, it had zero effect. But when I can laugh about it, make fun of it, and tease it out, again, with not necessarily approaching it like I need to convince this person of something else. It just became, if ever the topic came up, I was making a joke out of it, as opposed to like needing to change the way people thought about it.
What do you think, Brandon, about adding a cartoonist to this group?
A cartoonist? Well, we actually have one. Jaime. I don't know if you guys have seen Jaime's cartoons. He's extraordinarily gifted. He's the one who did What Really Happened at the Inauguration. Did you guys see that on YouTube?
No, that'd be awesome. Okay.
Yeah, it's an awesome cartoon. He took actual sound clips of Biden and just created a whole cartoon of the quote-unquote inauguration. It's hilarious.
Put it
I'll
in the chat.
I'll find it and post it.
Okay, awesome. Because I can see myself. I have a neighbor, for example, that is all about social justice. Yet at his core, he's racist, and he's like 80 years old, so I can't bring myself to fight with him too much. Plus, he loses his shit when I do. So, and I don't, I love the guy. I don't want to harm him. But sending him a good cartoon just to lift the consciousness under, and humor is a good. That just seems like it's just a really smart. It's just such a smart way to approach it. It's almost the only common sense that we have. After you said, like, oh yeah, that's a perfect approach. It's humor.
It became pretty clear to me because, I've used the example of Eddie Murphy, but there were a lot of comedians, Black comedians, Latin comedians, and they all kind of teased out racism, and it evaporated from our society. It evaporated from our culture. Like by the time we got into the early 90s, at least where I lived, there was no racism. Like maybe there were racist people, but they wouldn't say anything in public or anything. It was just like people were accepting, people were colorblind, like people were able to just see people for their character as opposed to their color. And now they're forcing the opposite down your throat. They're literally trying to stand on the shoulders of the social justice movements of the 60s, but they're perpetuating the opposite message. Whereas Dr. Martin Luther King said, he had a dream that one day his children would be judged by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. And now you have social justice where you're saying, no, color of the skin is all that matters. And that's what you need to focus on first.
It's actually to ignore their heritage and what makes them them by being colorblind. It's a very sore subject on that side of the spectrum. I know that because I've gotten called out for it. And for those of you that don't really know me, I'm mixed blooded. I got a little bit of everything but Asian in me. And when people ask me like to identify on a piece of paper or something like that, I'm like, are you black? No. Are you white? No. Are you Hispanic? No. Are you this? No. I'm just like, I'm kind of everything. So I always check the other box. And
other.
Yeah, I was like, other. I'm all of the above. I forget what I was saying now, but it's yeah, never mind. Go ahead. I got distracted by finding this guy's cartoon channel.
So,
Okay.
Brandon, it's interesting because I actually just walked away from a job because my boss was this way. So she had a whole, I guess I just label it somewhat of a narcissistic tendency. And if as Gingy had pointed out, if I didn't sacrifice my sense of self and overwrite it with what the indoctrination message, which was, we are the best in the organization. Only we know how to really do deals. Right? Whereas I went out and I started partnering with all the lines of business, and so I'd never done this kind of business before, and I was able to, I was their top salesperson nationally, and it's never happened before, simply through my partnerships. And I thought of you guys every day because I thought, man, there's just nothing that beats partnership. It's just unbelievable, right? It compounds everything. And she was pissed, and she just kept trying to beat me down and get me, and I'm like, no, look, this is not how I see the world. We went to lunch. I said, look, it is apparent to me that we have different worldviews. I respect how you choose to show up, that you get to do that. This is just how I show up. And so I got the threat, be careful, because, essentially we'll mix you. But she couldn't because I was the top salesman in the whole company. So she wanted to, she just couldn't. But anyway, at the end of the day, I had to walk away from like $3 million in deals. That's how sticky it was, and she guaranteed. But anyway, I thought, how could I have approached her? Because in lunch, I'm like, look, do you really want to run it like a mafia? But had I circulated some kind of humor, because it just could have lightened things up and enlightened things a little bit. It could have sort of loosened the strings on the other teammates as well, who were almost suffering because if she didn't want them to win that day, they didn't get to win that day. Now, I was winning in spite of all of them, right? So,
yeah, I would say the level of effectiveness that you're going to have with humor depends on their level of buy-in. Like, for example, the full-blown social justice warrior, like I majored in critical race theory in college, and now I'm in human resources. They take themselves way too serious, and this ideology has a tendency to create psychopathy. Like they get to the point where, and I mean that quite literally. Like literally, it creates psychopaths, because you get to a level of cognitive dissonance where so much anxiety gets built up that you have to completely split your personality up in order to accommodate or to justify what from an outsider is clearly not aligned with your values. So because there's this conflict of what you're pushing with what your values are, it creates a high level of anxiety to the point where, you've seen it, like with those who have what we call Trump, what's TDS? Trump derangement, right? Trump derangement syndrome, right? So they're literally people who are losing their fucking minds because of that disconnect, because of that cognitive dissonance that's created by a conflict of what you're pushing, what you're saying, what you're doing with your underlying values.
Which is exactly what you were talking about last week.
You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of weaponization of words, right? So at the end of the day, this woke crowd, what they end up doing is throwing anti in front of anything. And if you're not part of that movement, then you're the opposite. So, for instance, for the racists, if you're a racist, then you're bad, right? But then if you're anti-racist, then if you're not anti-racist, then you're bad, because they threw anti in front of racist. Same thing with anything else. And it kind of reminded me of the whole thing of using their words against them. Okay, so if you're anti-racist, then you're racist. So who's against racism? I mean, everyone's against racism as far as I'm concerned, but they throw anti in there, and now if you're not part of that movement, you're racist. So,
Right. If you
the same
don't buy
thing.
into their ideology, you're
Yeah,
racist.
it's the same thing with the whole. Remember the whole voter fraud? They threw in there every vote should count, and let's throw their words back. It's like, well, no, not every vote should count. Every legal vote should count, and so it's kind of like you have to use words against them in order to battle them, because they try to weaponize words every day and making different definitions. And now it's so easy to create a new definition of words, because all you have to do is go to their woke liberal leftist websites like dictionary.com, and within minutes they got a new definition up. You know, like what's one? Oh, sexual orientation. That was one. You know, now it's derogatory. I never knew that. I got blasted for calling someone a thug, and I'm like, to me, a thug is someone who commits crimes, a bully, someone who's violent. No, now it's a young black man. I'm like, what? I'm like, what? What are you talking about? Where that now? And then you go and look at the definitions. Yeah, holy crap! They just threw it in there. Now if you call someone a thug, you're calling them a young black man a thug. It's like, wow.
That's crazy.
It's crazy. They don't have to print books anymore. They just go online, and it's a few clicks and they got a new definition of.
They changed their Wikipedia entries and their dictionary.com entries, and they've got, like you said, weaponization of the language. Just so you know, Giuseppe, I'm the director of the anti-killing grandma movement. And so if you don't agree with my ideologies, then you want to kill grandmas.
Yeah, exactly.
Did you release COVID virus?
Go tell Cuomo that one.
One thing I want to point out in this conversation is that, to me, all of the weaponization of words and what you were talking into, Rachel, those are all, for me, like booby traps. Those are all ways to easily engage in the conflict that is not only in society but in individual minds. And I make it a point for myself to not be interested, or to just not engage, period, in the conflict. If they have something they need to prove and something they need to say, the person I'm engaging with, I'm happy to hear it. I'm happy to let them prove it. Go for it. Doesn't mean I have to believe it. And if I were to jump into that in the space of conflict and be like, well, no, here's why you're wrong, instead of just seeing where they're coming from, it's so easy to dive into that conflict and be part of it instead of remaining neutral. And to me, that's the balance, which is, Brandon, is why I was asking you how you tease without patronizing somebody, or at least having them feel
without
like
mocking.
patronized.
Yeah.
Because I have gotten that too. Not only have I gotten the color blindness ramifications or call out saying, that's actually counterproductive, and you're actually supporting racism and bigotry by not identifying, but not acknowledging somebody else's race, which to me is like assuming they're part of a specific race based off the colors and by the way they look, which I already had problems with that. Anyway, but I've been called out for not for basically, because I'm laughing, because they're trying to convince me of something that's like, hey, yeah, I mean, I see where you're coming from. They feel my laughter as a form of attack. And I've been called out saying, hey, don't you patronize me. Don't you, this is serious stuff. I'm not making a joke right now. Don't laugh this off. They feel attacked by that lightheartedness, as if they want me to take this as serious as they do. And like you just talked into, some people out there, doesn't matter what ideology they're holding on to or really committed to, some of them may take it so seriously that you can't just laugh right through it and brush it off and make light of it, because they will never make light of the situation until
Well,
they start
that's why
taking
I
light
was
of
thinking,
themselves.
like, if that cartoonist was there, if you're like this gentleman in my neighborhood, if I shoot him a cartoon, it's one, it's topically relevant. Two, it's funny. And three, it might invite an open mind, and I'm not there as if my ego needs to be present as the invitation. Like he gets to experience whether he has an open mind or not, and a laugh or not. I simply just sent it because it made me laugh.
But it's a
Well,
read the room type of situation.
Yeah, it is. And so remember, we said, it depends on their level of buy-in. But here's, if someone takes themselves real serious, a way to make fun without making fun of their idea or them directly is set up a straw man and make fun of that, like I just did with the anti-killing grandma movement. That's a straw man. That's a straw man for the anti-fascist, right? Or the anti-racist. It's a straw man. So I'm not making fun of the anti-fascist. I'm not making fun of the anti-racist. I set up a straw man called the anti-killing grandma movement, and I knock it down, and I make fun of it. But the relationship there is obvious. You know what I mean? Like, and because I painted it ridiculously, like, well, yeah, who's not anti-killing grandma? Well, who's not anti-racist? Who's not anti-fascist? Like, it's just as ridiculous as what you guys are saying, but I've painted it more ridiculous, and then I knocked it over, and I made fun of what I created, the straw man that's standing in place of their ideology.
That reminds me, George Carlin was very good at this stuff. And back in the day, when you listen to his stand-up, man, that guy spoke so much truth. It came to the point where, back in the day is like, I wasn't so, I guess, my eyes weren't as open as it is now. So, now looking back, I'm like, damn, someone probably killed the guy because he was so out there with his stand-up comedy about all this and, government takeover and, the elites and everything, that you're not part of the clique, you're not part of the club. So, you're just a sheep. That is kind of crazy, the stuff when you hear them. So if you guys haven't heard George Carlin, you got to pick up something on YouTube. He's great.
It's hilarious. But one of the things I really like about what he does is he doesn't, like Brandon was saying, make a straw man and attack it. He's not taking what they're saying or any of these ideologies. He's boiling it down to the bottom line of what's going on. Like, for me, to make light of, say, something like anti-racism, I'm like, cool, let's all get in a fight over whether or not racism is good or bad. And that's something that the majority of people, like you already talked about, agree on. Racism, bad. And if you go right to that bottom line and make light of it, it's like, do we really need to have an anti-racist movement? Then somebody comes through and they start talking about the logistics.
Yeah, but you have to go back to Giuseppe's point of redefining what racism is, because that's what they've done. So now racism doesn't mean what you thought it meant, Gingy. Racism, by the definition of the anti-racist, is any system where you have inequity, which is unequal outcome. Again, boiling down a complex system, human society is definitely a complex system, to one variable, race. Like, well, you don't have equal numbers of this race and that race in, per capita in this sphere or domain of life, it must be racist. And then you say, oh, there's not equal representation anywhere. So the whole thing is racist. Yeah. And so the whole thing must be destroyed. And so they've redefined racism, and what we used to define as racism, they're defining as the solution to racism.
And they're doing the same thing. And I just realized that they did the same thing with minority. When you think back when someone's in the minority, they're in the, there's less numbers of that particular, ideology or that particular group of people. But now they redefine minority as person of color. Hispanic, Latino, Black, Asian, they're minority.
Which they actually make up the majority of the numbers.
But the white man's not a minority anymore. The white man's the bad guy, and it's kind of, they redefine minority to make it a more of a racial thing versus a group, a number, and that's
right.
It's kind of weaponization of words, redefine it. It's crazy. It's straight up 1984.
Right, and then they ignore inequities that don't go along with their narrative. Like, for instance, South Asians, people from like India, East Asians are overly representative in success and culture in our country. In our society, they are overly representative, meaning they're more successful in business, they're more successful in schooling per capita than any other group. But they ignore that because they're not the big bad white devil. So they leave that out of the equation completely. That's why you don't hear them talk too much about East Asians and South Asians, because they're overrepresented in what we call indicators of success within culture. They excel in school, they excel in business, they hold their per capita income is higher, so it doesn't fit with their narrative that the big bad white man's holding everyone down, well, except Indians and Japanese, evidently.
Yeah, let's not attribute it to maybe a little more hard work than other people, but it's a racial thing.
Right, exactly. And that's what they do. They, rather than boiling it down to a multitude of variables, which are at play here, including the culture of people from India and the culture of people from Japan, they boil it down to just race. And in fact, they're taking indicators for success and saying that they are actually indicators of white supremacy. Like, did you guys hear last week Bill Gates basically saying math is a form of white supremacy?
Oh my God! Yeah, that was crazy.
Math. Math.
Yep. I didn't even see it.
Now, keep in mind, advanced mathematics comes out of like Egypt and Persia. Hello, POCs, right? Like, this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. That now math is white supremacy. Oh, and being on time is white supremacy, and working hard is white supremacy. Which is like, what kind of fucking culture are you trying to create?
What are POCs?
People of color.
Gotcha. Sorry.
Point of contact, no, people of color.
I'm an anti-racist. I wouldn't know.
Now Cam's woke.
So when we're saying they, this is just a thing for me, obviously. We're not talking about the same they. We're just talking about the one. I mean, or is there a they that this group has agreed is the they?
Yeah, well, in reality, like, the people pushing this shit are rarely in the know of what agenda they're really pushing. Like, you have an entire group of people in this country, like the Ibram Kendis, that are, quote unquote, critical race theorists. And they are pushing these agendas, and they're pushing them hard, right? But who came up with these theories? Who brought these theories into academia? Who's the one who put all the fucking communists into positions in academia in the first place? Who's steering the media narrative towards all this? So there is a quote unquote they that's steering the whole ship and the entire agenda towards the destruction of our culture.
I blame Operation Paperclip.
That could be part of it. It could be part of it. But I'd say it goes far beyond that, because it's an international thing. This isn't just happening in our country. Like, it's funny. There was a lady in the British Parliament, and she just started railing on critical race theory because she was basically saying, look, this is an imaginary problem. Like, they had like a whole defund the police. Like, I don't know if you guys know England, but the cops don't even have guns. Okay.
Yeah, they don't.
And in reality, there are no police shootings or police brutality of any kind. So, but they were pushing the same shit that they were pushing here, they were pushing in England. And this lady in Parliament's all, y'all have lost your minds. This is insanity. This doesn't even happen here. And yet you're pushing these critical race theories.
Yeah,
and
they're just echo chambers. They're just parroting what they see. And actually, a lot of these people that are pushing or following all this narrative, when you ask them, well, why? They can't answer it. They're just repeating it, and they don't know why they're doing it, but yet they're still doing it. It's crazy.
I think this is why I get, because we talk about left and right and they and this and that. And really what you're talking about, Brandon, is a higher level they. Of they, that everything below this they is filled with parrots. Not everything, but there's just, as I wasn't watching who was speaking, but that the parroting, that sounds right to me. That manifests in all different social constructs, right? Even within families, parroting is a problem. It's not self-think.
Well, yeah, it's not thinking at all. Like, again, you got to remember, like, our entire educational system has turned from teaching people how to think into teaching them what to think. And so
totally.
that's all it is you get information. And because the academia at all levels, from kindergarten through to the highest levels of university, are all teaching these principles. And so people go to school, and what do? They come out and regurgitate information because they can't think for themselves. They haven't learned to think. So all they do is regurgitate information. So and that's why, again, like why I think the comedians of the 80s were so successful in getting rid of racism, was because in making fun of it, it made people look at it. Because they were willing to, because it was funny and it wasn't an attack. Whereas right now, everything's an attack. So nobody's going to be willing to look at anything. And like I said, this is coming from both sides. This isn't exclusive to the left. The right is doing the same thing.
Right.
In their attacks against the left. So you have the left attacking the right, you have the right attacking the left, and nobody's going to be willing to look at anything if they're being attacked.
Which is the point.
Exactly. Divide and conquer.
Yeah, keep them fighting, keep them working. So it's interesting you say that. I actually had I have a number of individuals I know from like Ivy League institutions. I remember asking one that I believe to be one of the smartest or most intelligent what the difference was, and he actually said that. He said, we are taught how to think. So our mathematics courses are words. We have to write out why this mathematical formula proves this way. Whereas I went to public university, you were told what to think, right? So you never deduced the how or the why. You just, this is the answer, and until you gave them the answer. So that's an interesting point, and that is so true. The other thing I wanted to bring up is that I actually have some contacts from NASA, and one of the privileges I had was to serve at a nonprofit where we did acceleration and innovation for aerospace and other industries. And one of these individuals had a group that he belonged to that was the pioneering and settlement of Mars, essentially, or any planet. And they were teaching young children how to essentially settle, how to build societies, how to create clean water, and those types of things. So it's interesting as I hear you talk about people wanting to destroy. And then for some reason this pops up in my mind is, well, to what end? while others are trying to build and pioneer and settle. Forgive me if I took us left, but that sort of showed up for me. And so can you speak a little bit more about like the they that wants to destroy? I feel a little ignorant asking, but I still want to ask.
Well, I mean, if I could boil it down, it's behind it all is the same group of people that have been controlling shit for hundreds of years, and they control through the banking systems. Okay? So they've been pushing international communism for 100 years. Okay? So now we were the big thorn in the side of the elite, in that we had a constitutional republic, a form of government that had never been seen and that was uniquely resilient to their pressures. So they've been developing literally for 100 years how to take us down. And they've been slowly undermining all of our, bureaucracies of government, the agencies of government. They're infiltrating. They've been infiltrating academia with their thought leaders, people who believe in their system, who believe in the communist utopia. Okay? They want, and it comes down to, they don't really want a utopia. They want tyranny. But the constitutional republic would not ever allow for their tyranny, so it must be completely destroyed. And at the same time, all those countries that came up after us and who tried to model their governments like ours, well, they're in the crosshairs too. So this is why there's this global push for this international communism. That's why you see lockdowns in all these countries, right? They're getting everyone used to these ideas. They're pushing these agendas in universities in all countries. They've been infiltrating the systems of free republics for over 100 years, okay? So they is the people who want to control. Like they don't have enough control now. They already control our entire monetary systems, which gives them control of our bureaucrats. It gives them control of our politicians. It gives them control of our media. But that's not enough.
Well, could the word they, be conveyed as the 13 bloodlines of the Illuminati?
I think all of that is distraction. I think you don't know any of their names.
Right, I understand. That
They
makes sense.
they prop these people up like, oh, Clintons, and oh, the Bushes, and oh, the royal family. Dude, they aren't running shit. They're fucking puppets, in my opinion.
Same with
So true.
Bill Gates too, in my opinion.
Yeah, they aren't running shit. Like the people who run shit, they know that to keep their names out, because if shit goes down, guess who's going to get strung up? Gates, the Clintons, the royal family. You know what I mean? They know who's going down. They know how this shit works. They know if shit don't go their way, that we're going to string up all the people that they propped up as puppets. Just like Hitler wasn't the mastermind of the Nazi movement. And just like Mao wasn't the mastermind behind the communist China movement. There are always people in the background. And I have a feeling we don't know any of their names. They prop up people. They prop up the Soros. They prop up the Rothschilds. They prop up all these other people because they know if shit gets real, those are the people going down.
That was the most truth I have heard in a really long time. Or it feels like the most truth I've heard. That was brilliant. Thank you, Brendan.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could give you names. The reality is they don't exist in our world. They exist outside of our world. Meaning, and I don't mean like off planet or anything like that. I mean, maybe they do, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. What I'm trying to say is they exist outside of our systems of commerce. They exist outside of our systems of media. They exist outside of these systems. They orchestrate these systems. And they have their puppets in place. And they just pull strings. Because they know that if shit gets real, that they can just disappear. Because you never knew who they were in the first place.
Hey, Ginger.
What up, Greg?
What's up, brother? A little off topic, but I was curious. You ever write in "I am the future" in your other on the race card?
You check other and then you write in "I am the future."
No, just put I am the master of the universe, like raise.
Yeah, that's how I identify.
When you were speaking into it, I was totally thinking about the time machine when he goes into the future and everybody's the same race. So.
Raises the cult leader.
Now, I have thought growing up, I was like, you know, just logic being like my mom's mostly white, my dad's mostly black, and look, thinking, oh, if I came out brown, and imagine if everybody had mixed babies, eventually in the future, everybody would be brown. Now, genetics doesn't exactly work that way, but it is something that I've thought of. I am the future.
Well, I'm right there with you, Gingy. And I think that's what gave me kind of a unique perspective on all this was like just having mixed heritage, you know, where I can identify as nothing, or I could just pick from the wide range of things that other people pick from. So I always, as a kid, I kind of went through like, oh, well, I'm part this, so I'm this. And, oh, well, I'm also part this, so now I'm this. And so it kind of like, it just created a confusion within me because it seemed like all the people around me, it was pretty clear what they were.
I like to call those double binds.
Yeah. I was the one who would get the question, literally, people on more times than I can count, have asked me, what are you? As if I'm not human, right? So, what are you? Right.
When I first started talking to you on Independent, that's the way I was for sure.
Yeah, because it's just like I don't really fit necessarily, and people are like, you kind of look like you might be Hispanic, but your hair is pretty jacked up. I don't know what. Like my hair is like my hair is like an Australian native, right? An Aborigine. Yeah. I got like Aborigine.
When I first saw your name and stuff, I thought you were like maybe a mixed guy, maybe an afro, maybe long hair. Complete fucking opposite. When I seen your YouTube.
Yeah, so I think that gave me a unique perspective on like what does any of that really mean, So I was able to kind of like at a young age drop into like, is this even real? Like I was questioning as a kid, like how is skin color any more significant than eye color or hair color? Like we don't divide ourselves by hair color. We don't divide ourselves by eye color. Why? Why would skin color be any more significant than anything else that distinguishes one human being from another? What about ear size? Oh, we got the small ears over there. We got the big ears over there.
That's a great straw man, the ear guy, the big ear guy. Brandon, it's funny because my brothers they have the same hair as you. and they have like this changing skin. Like in the summer, they're really, really dark, and then they're really, really not. And we had the same, we would drop into the same mindset. We didn't know we were cool. We were down with it. It was it was nothing at some point, like, just because none of that was meaningful at some point. So that is so interesting that you say that. This whole call is fascinating because it relates to last week's call. And now I'm so curious about, all right, so we have the they, and we have the cult, we have the unsuspecting parroting, which are leaders of the subcults.
Right. Yeah.
Now, what is our responsibility?
Yeah, and like I said, we're at a unique time in history that they're now doing this mass indoctrination into the cult of wokeness. And it's, I mean, it's on one level, it's fascinating that that's even possible, that you can indoctrinate millions of people, you know, into a cult through the use of media, social media, and just things like that. I mean, and academia, because again, the indoctrination started in school. You know, my kid brought his homework a few months ago was totally freaking like communist indoctrination. Like it was a story about a flea circus and how the fleas needed to be getting paid equal to the owner of the flea circus, because, you know, they're just as important, again, not taking into consideration that Miss So-and-so, the, you know, person who ran the flea circus, took all the risk, put up all the capital. You know, it was pure communist propaganda in the form of a story about a flea circus.
Fascinating. Fascinating.
So going back to that, Brandon, how do we unmarry belief from identity and, you know, hear information as information and, you know, address it or call it out and or speak to it in some way? Let's talk a little bit into how we can be in relationship with this phenomenon.
Well, I'd say on the individual level. So for the people actually listening to this is work we can do for ourselves, because this is something, again, don't project out like this is what other people need to do because I got it right. No. We need to be in check with ourselves, and that identity is a false identity, right? We have this subjective identity. It's a story we tell ourselves about ourselves. And there's no real truth to it. And so we have this tendency to tie things to that identity, right? Like, for instance, in the first example I used, I'm a good parent is the story of anti-vaxxers and pro-vaxxers, right? They've tied their identity of good parent to either being pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine. And if you confront them with facts that contradicts their belief, they actually double down on their belief. They're not open to any information. So for us to be open to information, we need to find those distinctions of where we've tied facts or information to the story we have about who we are, that narrative, that identity that we hold, that image that we believe ourselves to be, right? That we convey out to others, this is what I am, this is who I am. And if it's somehow and in some way tied to information, then a challenge to the information becomes a challenge to who we are. So we become closed off to possibilities. We become closed off to information because we've tied the information to our self-identity. So as us, those of us here on this call, that's something we can do, is start to, for one, break down the story we have about ourselves. Don't take ourselves so serious, because in not taking ourselves so serious, we can laugh about the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, and we can laugh about our attachment to ideologies that we've embedded as part of our identity. So that's a practice that we can have through our examination of our own narratives about who we are. That identity, that subjective identity that we hold ourselves in, that image that we've created, that we curate, right, of ourselves.
You know, hey Brennan, you bring up a good point where you say that they double down on their beliefs if we bring them facts and whatnot. The way I see it is, people that are more conservative see the left side, which is the liberal side, more good people with bad ideas, whereas them as they in terms of the very liberal radicals that we see nowadays that have pretty much infiltrated every sector in our in our population, that they see the conservatives just bad people with ideas.
Right.
And so, and it's kind of like, it's hard because, like, I'm just going to even say it with, a few people that I know. It's hard to talk to them to the point where it's like, I can lead a horse to water, but I can't force him to drink. And it's like, dude, you're dehydrating yourself. Can you drink? And no matter how much you want to point, whatever facts you want to point, they're attached to their beliefs, and it's kind of like, I'm tired of talking to them. It's like, well, why am I'm wasting energy, and they're just an energy suck, and I don't know I honestly don't know how to talk to them without, like, just, hitting them over the head with a frying pan and said, wake up, but they think they're awake. They're not. I use the term sleepwalking because they're sleeping.
Yeah, and again, there is also, like, where we hold other, right? So there is this tendency, like, to create these dichotomies, to create this false division, and that's going to be an obstacle, regardless of what side of the spectrum you consider yourself to be on. So if you consider yourself on the right or you consider yourself on the left, but you hold yourself in that box, right? That's a part of that identity. It's a part of that image. It's a part of the story we have about who we are. Well, then we're automatically going to create those same kind of boxes for other, right? People outside of our values, outside of our beliefs, whatever. So we have a tendency, if we're going to box ourselves up and limit ourselves, we're going to do that with others, right? We're going to box them up. We're going to limit them. And so that's already going to create an obstacle right off the bat. I would say that the best approach is to, when you're talking to people, just be talking to people. You know what I mean? Like, rather than I'm on the right and I'm talking to someone on the left. And like I said, a great approach is teasing it, and if they take themselves real serious, don't tease their ideas directly. Don't tease them directly. Don't mock them, but set up a straw man of their beliefs and mock that, because then you can actually mock it together. Like, you start to create these straw men of this ridiculousness, like I said, like my anti-killing grandma, right? I'm part of the anti-killing grandma movement. If you don't believe what I believe, well, then you want to kill grandma. Like, that's absolutely ridiculous, but that is exactly what people who call themselves anti-racist and who call themselves anti-fascists are doing.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like, I think that was why we saw so much progress in getting rid of racism through the 80s and 90s, was because of comedians, because they were able to make fun of whiteness. They were able to make fun of these racist tendencies that people in general had, and we were able to laugh at it. And because we were able to laugh at it, we were able to look at it, and we were able to let it go. So I'm convinced Eddie Murphy did more for civil rights than any social justice warrior today has done, because he was able to make fun of that, and we were able to laugh along with it, look at it, and let it go. So there is value, especially when remember, we communicate at three levels. We communicate at we'll call the superficial level, which is when you're just conveying information, right? So whether it's facts or you're speaking about events or circumstance, whatever, you're just conveying information. Well, beneath that, you're communicating on an emotional level. And beneath that, you're actually communicating your identity. And you got to realize that when people have tied their identity to a set of information or facts, that they're going to, that backfire mechanism, that backfire phenomenon or effect is going to be present, because you're not just challenging an idea, you're challenging their identity. So that's why they double down on their belief, because they, like, you know, again, the example I used with the pro-vaxxer and the anti-vaxxer parent, both have tied their identity of good parent to being pro-vax or anti-vax. So if you attack either of their positions, you're attacking their identity. And so they're going to double down on their belief. You know, if you could bring them all the facts in the world, you could bring them notebooks full, here's all the science, and they will double down on their belief, because you're not really attacking information. Or I shouldn't say attacking. You're not challenging information. You're challenging their identity.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's all about identity politics. So.
No,
Yeah,
but your point, Brandon, is that they take, right, so there's a couple of ways to do it. Eddie Murphy, of course, doesn't, you know, he's not present with these individuals, so they're inherently not attacked in their identity. It's sort of agnostic information. And so you could create that same sort of scenario person to person by creating a straw man. But the point is well made, is that there has to be a way to show up in an agnostic way. So if you feel yourself attached to a position, then that's check number one. Perhaps you're not in the right frame of mind. But if you're curious about inviting other ideas, or at least playing with ideas, then perhaps you're ready to then create a straw man and do person-to-person kind of agnostic idea play, if you will.
Right. That's why it starts with being able to, like, not take yourself serious. Like, seriously. Don't take yourself serious. Like if you can make fun of your own ideologies, and you can tease them and tease yourself and make fun of yourself, well, then then you have an opening, because you're not taking your own ideas and yourself too serious, so that it becomes more natural and not like mocking when you tease other people's ideas, because you're already in the practice of teasing your own ideas and making fun of your own concepts and beliefs. So it creates like an even playing field, so to speak. Whereas I'm willing to look at and make fun of and not be attached to my ideas creates an invitation for others to do the same, right? So if you take yourself super serious and you are completely attached and have attached information to your identity, well, then there is no opening for you. You are not open to information, right? So if you're not open to information, then are you truly having a discussion, or are you trying to indoctrinate? It works both ways. You can be an indoctrinator, and you can try to indoctrinate others.
That's a really good distinction, right? Because you think you're inviting them into a new possibility, but if you're not willing in that moment to also be invited into a new possibility, then what you're doing is indoctrinating. That's a good point.
I think that's one of the biggest takeaways we can all, leave this call with, is whether or not we are trying to convince somebody of something and indoctrinate them into our belief system, or if we're actually neutral. If we're actually accepting and compassionate for these other people. So that really cuts both ways. That's an immense point.
Alrighty. Anyone else got anything to contribute? Questions? Comments?
I do have a couple of things, if you don't mind.
Not at all.
So I was having a great discussion with my stepmother this weekend, and we're both conservatives. And so she's arguing with me her points, which I obviously in that instance agreed with her. I'm like, you don't need to argue. I agree with you. And I noticed she was putting people into a category, lots of different categories. And since our conversation last week, I noticed I am more aware of the categories and identities that I am instilling on other people. And, you know, the first step is recognition, right? The next step is now dissolving those categories. So I brought it up to her and I said, well, can we just like get rid of the fact that it's not all illegal immigrants who don't want to seek citizenship? You're saying you don't understand why they don't want to if they want to live here and reap the benefits, but let's not put them all in one category. I think everybody might have a different reason. So have you talked to somebody who hasn't? Well, no, but I asked other people who are here seeking citizenship. You know, you're not really asking the right people there, Mom. So we had a great conversation about identifying people and putting them into categories and making them part of something that they may not be. And I asked her, I said, you know, when I heard on TV the news anchors accusing Trump supporters of being white supremacists, like how does that make you feel? Because it really fucking pissed me off. And she goes, yeah. She goes, I'm not. And I said, neither am I. But that's what some people are telling other people, and these other people are choosing to believe it. They're putting us in categories, and we're doing the same thing. So Let's just drop that, and let's just say that person did XYZ, hurt my feelers, and move on. But let's not put them in any type of category. And if we can all start there individually. And I found that conversation was extremely easy because we were both coming from the same place already. And so she was already more open to it because she was wanting to hear my opinion about the same thing that she was excited about speaking about. And so I felt like I had a breakthrough with a very stubborn woman. And so I'm very excited, but you know, I didn't realize when I came into last week's conversation that I was in the exact place I was at to need that conversation. I'm always walking around so pissed off and hatred just flowing through me because no one is waking up and seeing what I see. So the second part to my statement is thinking back of what woke me up was seeing something happen that made me go, huh? And I went and sought out research on my own. And as I've been talking with more people, I asked them, what woke you up? And I have yet to find one person that says, I was in a conversation with somebody and they said something so profound that I was like, maybe I need to change my way of thinking. Now, I'm not saying that that doesn't happen out there and that we shouldn't fight for truth and try and help people wake up. What I'm trying to say is we shouldn't get discouraged if we aren't able to make breakthroughs, because what you might be doing is planting seeds that they then later go look up. And I asked my stepmom, very combative woman, very passionate about her beliefs. I said, have you ever had a conversation with someone where you were expressing yourself and talking your point of view and somebody said to you, that's a good point. You know what? I see it your way now. Totally sorry. And she goes, no. And I was like, okay, so why do you keep expecting people to say, you know what, you're right? And
it might be your approach.
definitely could be your approach. Absolutely. Because I know I've been in conversations where I'm like, that's a good point. But it took a lot for me to swallow my pride to say that. So some people might be hearing what you're saying, they just not be vocalizing it because they might not want to yet. And so I just want to tell people to hang in there. Don't get discouraged if you're not seeing the red pills drop.
Yeah, and again, there is different levels of buy-in. Like, some people are just going along to get along, and they aren't really buying into any of it. So they're going to be much easier to convince with a little bit of information. But some people have bought in, and they've already, taken action, and they've already spoken, the ideological, the proper ideological phrases, right? And they've admitted their white fragility and their white privilege, and they have denounced our entire culture as institutionally and racist, and so they've already got a level of buy-in, and so they're going to be the ones that you have to be more tactful with, because they've tied their identity to the information, to the ideology itself. So, but people who are just kind of like go along to get along, and they don't talk about any of this, they're going to be more open because their identity has not been tied to the ideology or any information regarding those ideologies. So that you can have a pretty, just a regular conversation, exchanging information. And like you said, the seeds are planted, and then an awareness happens. There's an awakening moment, what the Zen would call it, a moment of satori, where it dawns on them. They get it. It hits them. Or they go and they do some research of their own, and they wake themselves up. So there is all different levels of buy-in. And yes, really, it's about that. We've talked about this in some of the previous calls. It's about that personal relationship that you establish with each individual. Being in a place of authentic, trusting, compassionate, understanding. Like when you create a space like that to be with people in conversation, well, then there's going to be more openness as well. So yeah, Mom's approach to, of being combative isn't necessarily the way to go. You're going to get extraordinarily low results with beating people over the head with your ideology, and like Gingy mentioned just a minute ago, it's just indoctrination. It is indoctrination that we're attempting to do on others, as opposed to, is your intention really to wake people up, to have them open their eyes, to have them think for themselves, or is it to get them to believe in what you believe? Because that's what the tendency is, because that's what's comfortable. That's growing your own cult, right? So that's where we began this whole conversation, was around that cult ideology, that those mechanisms of a cult, where when I'm in the group and all the group thinks the same things, and you always create the in group and the out group, right? And again, this is happening on both sides of the political spectrum. I told you earlier, I hear it on the right. They're saying, well, there's only two types of people, patriots and traitors, right? So what do? They have the in group, patriots, people who think like them, people who believe what they believe, and then traitors, people who don't think like them, and people who don't believe what they believe. So you have this in-group, out-group tendency with cults, and that's not thinking. Thinking for yourself means not necessarily being able to be fit to the mold of an ideological group. If you have the freedom to think for yourself and to challenge ideologies within your group, well, then you can start to dismantle your own cult, which is like what you talked about with your experience with your mom, was, being able to meet her where she was at, and then get her to see that, look, they're doing this to us and we're doing that to them. How can we expect any kind of a different result if we do the same thing to them, right? If we just pigeonhole everyone who doesn't think like us and say all immigrants are such and so, all Democrats are this way and that way, right? So just like they're saying, all Trump supporters are racists and bigots, right? So this is happening on both sides. And this is why we need to be aware of the cults that we are creating and becoming parts of by just adapting to an ideology and then tying that ideology to our identity, which will make it harder and harder for us to let go of the ideology because we've tied it into our identity.
Brandon, I think actually, Lynette, that was brilliant, and Brandon, really great close. I think what you taught in your class and your coaches did so well was contribution isn't attached to ego. That real, legacy and contribution to a greater good is not attached to ego. And so, while it's not common for somebody to say because of a conversation with you, it's because it may not manifest like that. They might feel it coming from within, but you planted that seed, and that was your contribution. So if we remove our ego from wanting to know it was related to you and your conversation, or me and my conversation, then I just trust that you've just contributed a seed, and you hope that, it continues to grow, and perhaps you'll see that grow, and it may not. And if it is not associated with you and your contribution, then in some way that's even more divine, because it came from within them. So I learned that.
That's actually a great point, because that was something I struggled with for years. Because I would come up with this great information, these great sources of information, these what I felt were enlightening topics or whatever, and then I would share them with people, and then they would come back years later as if it was a brand new idea and that they had thought of it. It frustrated me because I'm like, I told you that years ago. So there's definitely having a humility and a humbleness and no expectation of how and why people shift in their ideologies or their come-froms or the way that they think or what they think will definitely benefit both you and them, because it's going to be stronger. It's going to be better if it comes from within them, as opposed to, well, so-and-so told me this.
And
just for the record,
to last week's conversation, making sure you create the space to where they feel comfortable to come back to you. If you are in the moment of the conversation where you're creating that space, then perhaps you will be able to recognize and see when they want more information, because they will feel comfortable coming to you and saying, okay, like we talked about last week, okay, what do you know about this? And I think it will help soften the conversation if you come from a place of acceptance, of making sure that you see both sides and not indoctrinating people. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it also, that same approach when, we were talking about teasing out ideologies, you can't do that if you're not creating that kind of a safe space with them. That trust, that acceptance, that understanding, that compassion, because then your teasing becomes mocking. And you're just going to drive them deeper into the ideology. They're just going to double down. So that's even important in that, in the teasing, the making fun, or setting up of a straw man of an idea and knocking it down. It's really important to create that experience with the person you're having the conversation with, even if you're teasing it out, so it doesn't come across as mocking.
And to be clear on where you're coming from with everything. That's like what your goal is, what your intent for saying what you're saying is, and honestly, that's probably the biggest contribution we could all give to the planet right now, is to be clear on why we're doing and saying what we're doing and saying. Meaning, if I'm having a conversation with somebody, am I trying to enroll them or indoctrinate them? Am I trying to be right and convince them that I am smarter or that I have the correct understanding? Or is my intent to, support them in thinking critically, thinking for themselves? Is my intent to support them in their journey and understand why they're talking and speaking into the things that they're speaking into? The intent behind what we're doing is critical in these moments, because a lot of people, like Giuseppe was saying, they're just regurgitating what they've heard, and that's not specific to any side of any conflict. That's across the board right now. There is a ton of people, like we've already addressed, that are simply just regurgitating what they've said or regurgitating what they've heard because they've learned what to learn and not how to learn. And if you're committed to supporting somebody through learning how to learn, you can say, well, could you show me that information? I'd be really interested in hearing it. Or maybe that's right, I'd need to read more. Do you have any resources? Inquiring in those ways can prompt people to, well, let me give an example. Back in my super strict anti-vax days, I was totally committed to trying to change people's minds and letting them know how stupid they've been. And the things that broke me out of that were not the people that wanted to argue and fight with me, because I had every rebuttal on the planet. The thing that broke me out of that, in that fixed position, were the people that wanted to learn more from me. So I said, hey, can you give me the information about why vaccines are bad? Then I had to go digging to find the facts that supported what I was up to and what I was saying. And what I learned through that process has me more so in a state of, I don't know enough about all vaccines. I know enough about the specific ones that I've looked into, that I've been basically coincidentally I've needed to look into because of events going on in my life. And because of that, I've learned where this information is. I've learned a lot about a lot of vaccinations. I've learned a lot about how they could be beneficial and how they could be detrimental. I've learned a lot about the entire field. But before that, I was just regurgitating shit I heard on a documentary, or my dad, or friends, or at work, or whatever. So being really clear where I'm coming from and why I'm saying it, as well as being able to connect with people on those levels, to engage with them, to learn more, or be clear where I'm coming from and be able to meet them where they're at, basically is what I'm saying.
That is such an excellent point. And it only would come up that way if you were genuinely in a space of not being attached to your own ideology.
Exactly.
Because then it's not, this shouldn't be a tactic so much as a genuine come from of like, well, you know what? I really don't know that much about that. Can you tell me more about that? Because I'm genuinely in a space of wanting to know more about the subject. It's the result is they're going to dive deeper into learning more about the subject, possibly. Again, no expectation of outcome.
We both
there.
are.
Yeah.
It's like one of the reasons why I committed 3 months of my life to learning about the flat earth theory, because I genuinely wanted to know why people believed the earth was flat. And I learned just about every excuse and facts and sources that they could cite, and I went through all of it. I spent a lot of time on that, and those people firmly believe what they believe because that's what they've studied. That's what they've really gone down the rabbit hole to learn about. But bottom line, they're all saying the same things. And they absolutely have confused what facts mean and what facts are facts.
Right. Come at me, bro.
You know, Gingy,
That's such a funny video.
it's really interesting you bring up how that someone being sincerely interested, like shifted your own stance, or like how hardcore you were in your stance. Because specific to vaccines, I think I might have mentioned this, but that kind of reversed roles where there was a couple people who were saying, "Oh yeah, you should totally get the vaccine." The person happened to be pregnant, and instead of countering them, that the question asked, well, what would be the benefit of it? And when they realized that they were both kind of stumped, and they didn't really readily have all these reasons why they should even like chase after the COVID vaccine, because of like, they're not high risk, they're young women, they have a baby, and that actually changed their mind. And then suddenly they said, oh, maybe you shouldn't run out and get it. So it's like totally counterintuitive, but it worked. And he said, okay, I'm just going to back off. I think I got my wish. So that's really profound.
Ultimately, where that inquiry left me was I only know about the yellow fever vaccine and about the mRNA vaccine that's coming out with and related to COVID. All the other vaccines, the measles, polio, the flu, I don't know shit about because I haven't done my diligence. So rather than me assuming that I know everything about all vaccines and saying they're all terrible, including all the ones to come in the future that I so arrogantly believe I know about, I can say with confidence, yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's a vaccine out there that I would take. I don't know, because I haven't had to take any of the ones that that have crossed my path. And in the future, there may be vaccines that come out that are incredibly beneficial, that save millions of lives and injure nobody. I don't know. And just by being in that space of I don't know, I'm less attached to what my belief was earlier, and my space of inquiry invites people into being in that same space with me. Like, would you just take the recommendation of the doctor because the doctor said so? Would you like to know why the doctor said so? Would you like to know why some vaccines may be better than other vaccines? Why is it that so many people don't take the flu vaccine when it's been around for so many years? There's so many things out there that actually I've looked into the flu vaccine too, because that is one that I was very curious about last year in particular, because all the talk about a COVID vaccine, I wanted to know what other coronavirus vaccines in the past have worked. Since it's the novel coronavirus, there must be a old coronavirus vaccine that has seen some success to base their Project Lightspeed or Warp Speed or whatever they called it off of. Anyway, I'm saying all this to say that the space that I was left in was in being honest with myself about what I know and what I don't know. And obviously the enormous vast sea of what I don't know. For all I know that there's a vaccine that's coming in 2580 that is completely a cure-all that has zero side effects. Sweet. I don't know that. That's definitely a possibility coming in the next 400 years. I don't know. So and being less attached to my beliefs.
And Gingy, you don't know if you're going to be around.
Exactly. Maybe I'll take that one.
I really feel, though, like with some of the stuff, like with the moment we're at right now, where stuff is becoming more and more ridiculous, in my own humble opinion, that just asking people to repeat some of the stuff and just being, just like you're saying, just honest and humble and being like, I'm kind of confused that there's all these other genders. Can you just explain like why this is that way, or just asking like the real questions that really truly, I mean, like I know like I laugh about it and I present this stuff like it's just I just can't handle it, so I tend to be that way, but I really am sincerely interested in some of these questions about why this is coming up, and we're talking about all this, but just saying when this is coming up with someone who's like, oh, of course we all can choose, and or with with the masks or with anything, and just really asking like, well, if two masks, then how, if you're wearing two, then why do I still need one? Like, don't you already have two masks now? Or just some of these basic questions, and that it really is hard for people to come up with all these facts about proving, the efficacy of whatever, catching corona. I don't know. Anyway, I'm very intrigued by that as a thing, rather than sharing more facts. Like I brought this up last week. I just think the facts are losing their pizzazz because everybody's got them, and none of them really hardly mean anything anymore, because it's like, I don't know. I mean, somebody, like I saw, I forget, somewhere on here, somebody was saying how like it was like a New York Times headline. I think it was New York Times, but it said, basically like critical thinking isn't all it's cracked up to be. And basically you shouldn't, yeah, did you, like you shouldn't just be going out and research, doing your own research, because it's just a waste of time, because you're going to end up getting a bunch of false information. And the example that they brought up was something from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And they said, rather than even looking at what he said, they typed in Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and it said, well, he's an anti-vax conspiracy theorist. And so he said, fine, so I don't even need to look into what he said, because clearly he's, a whack job. And anyway, it's just, so people are done with facts. The day of the facts is is coming to a junction. So I don't know. Maybe just.
It was a Forbes article.
Yeah, that's a great point, Michael. Where do we go if facts don't matter anymore? And that's a question I've been in all of 2020, because it doesn't matter what facts are saying, what information, because every single person has collected facts that support their beliefs. Like, as soon as the CDC released a report, their comorbidity report last year, you had half the population jumping up in arms. See, only 6% of all the COVID cases are legit COVID. All the other ones are not due to COVID. And you had the other side of people jumping up and saying, yeah, you see, this is all the different diseases that COVID can kill you from. This all, and you had both sides taking the same release of information and arguing their points with it. So the question remains, where do we go when facts don't matter anymore? When they're just ammunition to defend a belief system?
And I wonder, Gigi and Brandon and everybody, actually, I was thinking through this as you were talking, and it seems to me that to invite critical thinking, the reason, this goes back to, again, to Brandon's statement last week, and how, not being in your own integrity, in your own truth, in your own alignment leaves one anxious. And so everybody's just around being anxious. And for me, when I see people taking hard, fast positions, it's a comfort. They're soothing themselves, or attempting to soothe themselves. It doesn't quite work, and that's why they hold on so tightly, because they feel a disparity to soothe. And so, and again, as I'm talking, I feel like my position is a little strong on this. So, but that said, I feel like in our conversation, if we're going to invite individuals into critical thinking, and we are also inviting ourselves into critical thinking, one thing, thankfully, to Brandon and his team, Greg, Gingy, Patricia, I mean, I have a really healthy sense of self, so I don't mind being uncomfortable for an extended period of time because I know who I am. But that's not the case for my neighbors, most of the individuals that are around me on a regular basis. And so I feel a responsibility to give them some kind of comfort position to take. Like, we can invite them into critical thinking, but shouldn't I also invite, oh, and have you considered this? I don't know. It brings me, sort of, I don't know. It's a more complicated conversation, but I wonder if instead of disrupting them some more, which is going to give them the experience of you bring disruption to them, that you actually bring them to a place of something peaceful. Anyway.
Be comforting.
There you go. Just that easy.
So I would say that in a space where facts are literally on the moon, what is left? Brandon broke down 3 states earlier. There's the superficial communication, there's the emotional, and there's the identity. And those are 3 different spaces to communicate from. Does I have that right, Brandon?
Yep.
So if you're communicating with somebody about anything, really, it's the facts are on that superficial level. I'm conveying to you information that should change the way you feel or identify. That's not exactly how it works. You can dig down beyond that and connect with somebody on an identity level. You can connect with somebody on an emotional level and have much more effect, I would assume. I know if somebody plays to me, it depends on where they're coming from. Like if I see a commercial pulling on my heartstrings, my immediate reaction is F you. If my heartstrings are being pulled by, this cult-like group I was in last year, that ended in a big F you. But when people are applying to my emotions and they're coming from a space of love, like I give it up freely. I connect with them in that space. And to me, 2 things here, actually. Number 1, where are you coming from in the conversation? Are you coming from a space of love? Are you coming from a space of cult enrollment, or what? Being clear on why you're doing what you're doing. And then 2, are you appealing to their emotions? Are you appealing to who they are as people, or any other type of being? Are you just trying to, speak a bunch of facts at them compassionately? What level are you communicating to them on, and why are you communicating to these people? That will drastically shift. Just being present to it. Not even saying there's anything to change, but that will drastically shift, just being present to it, the conversations that you're having.
Yeah, and you can relate. Like, for instance, relating, information that at one point you may have had tied to your identity that you've let go of since, and the struggle that you went through in really creating a new narrative of who you were because you had this ideology or whatever tied to who you were, your identity, and then finally gave up the ideology or the information, let go of it, and therefore had to build up your identity. Because it's about that humility, right? That ability to be humble, and or even epistemological humility, where what I know or what I think I know, being humble around mistakes I've made in what I thought I knew, and how I had my identity tied to those mistaken knowledge, that mistaken information, those mistaken facts, whatever it may be. Because then you're creating the opportunity for them to acknowledge information that they've tied to their identity being wrong, and how there is, the possibility of letting it go and not losing who you are. Being able to rewrite the narrative, the story of who I am, in regardless of the information or the knowledge that I had tied to my identity at one time. I remember this one time I bought that stupid shit off the infomercial. It's actually an important place to acknowledge, because in our society, we have a tendency to judge people with poor judgment or to not trust people with poor judgment. So that, again, that's a direct attack. If I've bought into an ideology, then to admit that there's something wrong with the ideology is to admit I have poor judgment. And that's not simple. That's not easy for people to do, because there's a stigma within our society that there would be a lack of trust if you have poor judgment. And so being able to relate of my own mistakes is also creating permission for others to admit their mistakes, because then there's acceptance and compassion for their lack of judgment or their failures of judgment. Because that's probably one of the biggest obstacles when people have bought in to the ideology, is that if I admit it, because it's easy to justify it, especially right now where there's this mass indoctrination, this worldwide indoctrination, where they're giving you all the tools you need to justify these ideologies. It's much easier to just justify and stay hidden in the herd. Whereas to admit that I have poor judgment is to invite criticism and to invite a lack of trust upon me. And so that there's only a willingness to admit poor judgment when you feel that there is acceptance, compassion, forgiveness, and grace on the other side of the conversation.